So next up, we have Bart Miller, whose the subject of his presentation is entitled, "Where Do Waves Come From?" The wave of waves, all kind of waves. And we had a big earthquake in Japan. They have P waves and S waves. Waves for Bart means surfing. I think you all saw the surfboard in the hallway on the way up here. We were going to stand it up in the room, but it's 10 feet 2, holy Toledo, so it wouldn't fit. Anyways, Bart works as an executive coach, works with people, teams, and organizations to change. Whether change is imposed or desired, Bart facilitates the transition, helping people excel and grow. We know Bart, again, on the basketball court as the quickest 40-something I've ever seen. If you're tired, don't cover Bart. So with that, take it away, Bart.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so you guys have mentioned my surfboard outside. Yes, that is my gun. You know, I was in the emergency room last year with a good friend of mine who was surfing Mavericks with me one day, and he went to take off on a wave, and the wind came up the face, and he was left hanging, and he fell about 20 feet before he landed on the face of the wave and separated his shoulder. I ultimately met him at the ambulance, and then followed him to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, we were in the emergency room, and I just wanted to let him know that everything was taken care of. He was worried about his surfboards, he was worried about his wallet, his car, everything, you know, his family. And so I wanted to make sure that everything was cool for him. And I was talking with him, and I told him, you know, don't worry about it. I even have your guns for you. And at that point, we were over in the East Bay somewhere, and about 5 different heads swung over towards me. At which point I needed to explain to them what a gun was. And a gun is a surfboard that you use to surf really big waves. But that kind of leads into what I wanted to talk about today, which is a subject that I run into from time to time with people I talk with the kids that I work with, and they don't know what generates a wave. Where does a wave come from? How do we know when we're going to be able to surf? How do we know what the waves are going to look like? You know, we have busy lives. We work really hard, but at the same time, this is a passion of mine. I have a deep and visceral connection with the ocean and this energy that flows through it. And I wouldn't be able to pursue what I'm doing if I didn't know when the waves are going to be there. Because I'm very often over at Pillar Point, maybe with my boys, and we're either hiking or running or something along those lines. And people say, oh, where's the Mavericks? They call it the Mavericks for some reason. And I need to say it. I need to step back and say, well, it's right over that hill over there, but there's nothing to see today. And they said, well, we just saw pictures on TV yesterday. It's like, well, yeah, the swell was here and now it's gone. And so I thought I'd put together a little presentation, and I thought we were going to have kids in the audience, so it's kind of focused on them as well, for where do waves come from. Next slide, Q. This is Quentin, and Owen is over here. You know, so in figuring out where waves come from, I don't want to go back too far, but if we can just go back to, you know, just this acceptance that we have an Earth, and the Earth has some really wonderful water on it, that'd be a fine place for us to start. And then we can start asking some leading questions. Next slide, Q. Thank you. So the Earth has an atmosphere, and the atmosphere is really important in figuring out why we have waves. When the Earth formed, we had an initial atmosphere probably of hydrogen and helium, and a lot of that escaped outward, but there was still a lot of volcanic activity going on Earth, which was releasing a whole lot of gas. That gas came up into our atmosphere. Our Earth has gravity. It holds these gases in tight against it, and that is our atmosphere. Some lighter gases are going to bleed off into space, but we essentially have this blanket wrapped around the Earth that is not a solid. It functions kind of more as a liquid, And that's going to be really the start of where these waves come from for us. And the next step is really our weather. And we have this atmosphere, and we have an Earth that's spinning, that's left over from when our Earth was formed. It has to do with the angular momentum when this swirling disk of dust collapsed into form, the sun and our universe, or our solar system and what have you. And so we have this, our Earth is spinning because there's nothing to stop it. And we have this essentially liquid over the surface of it, if we can think of our atmosphere that way, which is spinning. And now throw in on top of that, we have temperature differences. And next slide, Q. And temperature differences are going to, and then we have temperature differences because of the way the sun is shining over the equator and the poles, and it's colder in one place or another. And temperature differences cause this air to move around. And so the air moves around in a way because of the temperature. When air is heated, it rises, and cool air is pulled in below it. And this is how we have high pressure and low pressure systems form. And Q, do you want to pull out that balloon? So we have that example here. So we all know that when we blow into a balloon, we're actually increasing the pressure. We're jamming a lot of air into that balloon. You want to blow that up, Q? And it's creating a higher pressure inside the balloon than outside the balloon. Well, it's the same thing that happens on Earth when we heat up various parts of the atmosphere. Now, unlike when can you blow that up, buddy? You got more air than that, right? Yeah. And so right now, there's a barrier between this high pressure air that's inside the balloon and the relatively lower pressure air that's outside of the balloon. But when that barrier is removed, go ahead and remove it. What happens, Q?
High pressure flows into the low pressure.
Right, and the pressure ultimately equalizes and stabilizes. And so we get these temperature differences on Earth, and it creates these pressure differences in general, and combined with the spinning of the Earth, we have constant movement of high pressure toward low pressure, and this creates wind. And so now we have this wind blowing as the atmosphere is trying to equalize itself, as it's trying to stabilize, as it's trying to get back to a stasis situation. And so as the air blows across the Earth's surface, can you just blow across the top of the table there, Oh? Yeah, not a lot happening there, right? No, but pull that water out. And when we blow across the top of that water, what happens? Go ahead, blow on it.
Waves form.
Yeah, you generate waves. This is no different than the ocean. It's just a much bigger stage, if you will. And as the wind blows longer and over a larger surface of the Earth, and if it's directed towards where we want to surf, we're going to eventually have waves where we want to surf. Now, we also have a plastic object over there, Q or O. If you force that down in the water, what happens? You gotta just jam that down in there. Yeah, it creates some pretty big waves, right?
For this.
Yeah. Well, right, but this is what happens when we have an earthquake that generates a tsunami, and we hear about tsunami waves and how they're different than wind waves. Well, what Owen is showing us there is exactly what would happen with a tsunami wave, is a huge portion of the Earth just drops out or it gets thrusted up, and the water that's above it is forced to move and can create this enormous tsunami wave. It generates an amazing amount of energy and sends it through the water. We'll get into that in a second. But for surfing, which is my primary interest, the thing that is most relevant to us is the wind that's generated by storms. Yeah, and so what we're interested in are not just any kind of waves, but surfable waves. This is a picture of a famous surf break in California. It's Rincon. It's notoriously crowded because it's such a beautiful and perfect break. And the surfers who go out there, if you live real close to the ocean, if you don't have a job, you can go hang out and just wait for these things to show up. But for the rest of us, we need to know when they're going to be there. And we need to know what it's going to be like when they're there. We need to know how big. We need to know for how long it's going to be there. We need to know what the tide's going to be like. We need to know what the wind is going to be like locally. Is it light out? Is it dark out? Is the tide high? Is the tide low? All these factors come into play as to whether we're going to be able to go and surf. Okay, so we touched on this a little bit. I'll just go into just a little bit more detail on this. Storms and the wind that is generated from them, what are we looking for when I'm looking for, because I look at forecasts that are way off in the future for the storms that are going to form, mostly in the North Pacific. That's where we get our waves in the winter. We kind of face west here in San Mateo County, and we are looking for waves that are generated in the North Pacific. So what we're looking for is a real nice low pressure system. And pressure is measured in millibars, so we're, average high pressure is something over 1,000 millibars, but we get a nice low pressure system of like 970 millibars. And if we can find a couple high pressure systems set up around those low pressure systems, not only can we tell that there's going to be a lot of wind, as Quentin showed us from the balloon exploding there, as the atmosphere tried to get to a neutral position again, but the way the high pressure systems are situated around a low pressure system are going to determine which way the winds are going to blow, because the wind is going to move from the high pressure system to the low pressure system, and so that's going to create the wind, and we hope that that wind is pointed at our beach. But we don't want the wind here on the coast. We want wind blowing hopefully over 1,000 miles away. It'd be real nice if a storm set up just below the Aleutians, off the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, and moved right over the date line and just sat there and just spun. For as long a time as possible with as big as wind as possible over the biggest part of the ocean as possible. And that is all going to determine the types of waves, the size of the waves, the period of the waves that show up where we're surfing. Yeah, and so I mentioned the wind speed and wind direction, and there's another term on here, fetch. Fetch is a term that we use for the square footage or the area of the ocean over which the wind is blowing. The greater the distance that the wind is blowing over is going to create bigger waves. If you can think of this little trough over here again, and imagine it stretched out really wide and long, the longer the wind blows, the more energy is going to be put into the waves. So when Owen's initial blowing there, first you blow over a smooth surface. Well, there's really no friction. Okay, your wind is going to flow over it, but it's going to tease some little ripple waves up. And as it blows longer, it continues to put energy into those waves and make those waves bigger and bigger and bigger. So as you can imagine, if the area that it's blowing across is bigger and bigger, these waves start here, they're blown on a little bit here, they're created as a ripple, and as they move along, more and more energy is being conferred to them as the wind continues to blow, hopefully at a very high rate, 40 knots, 50 knots, even 30 knots would be nice. These waves continue to pick up energy. And this energy is the shape of a wave. And we go back to our high school calculus, practically grade school for these guys now. And it's really going back to integration. Wind continues to blow into these waves, and as it blows into them, it creates a wave with a longer and longer period. And